I want you to hold two facts in your head at the same time. Fact 1. In 1918, American soldiers fought and died in the trenches of France. They came home to parades, to speeches about duty and sacrifice, to a government that told them their service would be remembered and rewarded. Fact 2. In 1932, the United States Army deployed tanks, cavalry with drawn sabers, infantry with fixed bayonets, and clouds of military-grade tear gas against those same veterans. On the streets of Washington, D.C., while the Capitol dome watched from less than a mile away, the man who led that assault, General Douglas MacArthur. The man who would later become one of the most celebrated military figures in American history. His cavalry commander that day, Major George S. Patton. His aide, Major Dwight D. Eisenhower. Three men whose names are on monuments, airports, and highways across this country, deployed by the President of the United States to destroy a camp of starving veterans who had come to Washington to ask for money they had already been promised. This is the story of the Bonus Army, the story America buried in the middle of the Great Depression and never brought back out. To understand what happened in the summer of 1932, you have to go back to 1918. When American soldiers came home from World War I, they came home to a specific economic reality that most people today don't fully appreciate. During the war, men who stayed home in civilian jobs were earning wages that had grown substantially. War production was booming. Factory workers, office workers, anyone who wasn't in uniform was making decent money in an economy running at full capacity. The men who put on the uniform took a massive pay cut to serve. A private in the U.S. Army earned $30 a month. The same man working in a defense factory might have earned 3 or 4 times that. He sacrificed his economic well-being to serve. And the government knew it, so in 1924, Congress passed the World War Adjusted Compensation Act. Veterans would receive a bonus, a payment to compensate for the wages they had lost while serving. The amount varied by service but averaged around $1,000 per veteran, roughly $17,000 in today's money. But here's the catch, and it's an enormous catch. The veterans couldn't receive this money until 1945. The certificates issued to them were essentially government bonds that would mature in 20 years. The government was betting that by 1945, the economy would be strong enough to pay out, and the veterans would be old enough that the money would serve as a comfortable bonus in middle age. Then 1929 happened, the stock market crashed, the Great Depression began. And by 1932, what had been a theoretical problem, veterans waiting for money they'd receive in 13 years, became a genuine crisis. Unemployment had hit 25%. Veterans who had come home from the war with skills suited to industrial labor found no industry. Men who had managed farms found crops worth nothing. Families were losing homes, going hungry, standing in bread lines. And every one of these men was holding a government certificate, a piece of paper promising them money that they couldn't touch until 1945. The march began in Portland, Oregon. A former Army sergeant named Walter W. Waters gathered about 300 veterans in May 1932 and proposed something simple and direct: march to Washington. Go to Congress, make them see us. Make them understand what this depression is doing to the men who fought their war. Demand early payment of the bonus. They rode freight trains east. The railroad gave them a train for free, understanding what these men were doing. As their journey east became news, veterans from across the country began making their own way to Washington. Walking, hitchhiking, hopping freight trains, driving cars that barely ran. Some brought their wives and children because they had nowhere to leave them. By June 1932, the first veterans were arriving in Washington, D.C. By the time the march reached its peak, approximately 43,000 people were in the Capitol. Of those, about 17,000 were actual WWI veterans. The rest were family members, supporters, and unemployed Americans who had joined the march in solidarity. They camped in abandoned government buildings along Pennsylvania Avenue. They built a city of tents, lean-tos, and shacks on the Anacostia Flats, a swampy stretch of land across the Anacostia River from the Capitol. They called it Camp Marks. Here's something that doesn't get mentioned enough. Camp Marks was racially integrated. Black veterans and white veterans lived side by side, cooked together, shared resources. In 1932, in a city that was legally segregated, where Black Americans couldn't use the same bathrooms or restaurants as white Americans, the Bonus Army's camp was one of the most integrated places in the United States. They created their own newspaper, the BEF News. They maintained their own police force. They kept the camp organized, clean, and disciplined. These were not radicals or criminals. These were soldiers applying military order to a desperate civilian situation. The atmosphere in Camp Marks was one of grim, determined dignity. Veterans who had lived through the Argonne Forest, through Bellet Wood, through years of mud and gas and artillery, they set up their Hoovervilles with military precision. The camp had streets with names. There were supply stations, medical points, regular roll calls. Walter Waters ran it like a regiment. The veterans believed they would win. They believed that if Congress could see them, if politicians had to drive past tens of thousands of veterans every day, that it would be impossible to say no. The human reality of it would force the issue. In June 1932, the House of Representatives passed a bill to authorize the early bonus payment. It was a genuine victory. The veterans celebrated. Then the bill went to the Senate. The Senate voted it down, 62-18. The bill was dead. Senators walked out of the Capitol after the vote and saw the veterans gathered on the lawn, waiting for news. Representative Wright Patton read the Senate's verdict through a megaphone. The veterans stood in silence for a moment. Then they began to sing. America the Beautiful, that's the moment that gets me every time. Men who had just been told by their government that their poverty was not the government's problem, singing about how beautiful the country was that had done that to them. The government offered to pay their train fare home. Most took it and left, but thousands stayed. Between 2,000 and 10,000 veterans refused to go. They had nowhere to return to. Washington was as good a place to starve as anywhere else. This is where President Herbert Hoover enters the story, and not in a flattering way. Hoover was not a cruel man. He was a Quaker, a genuine humanitarian who had organized massive food relief operations in Europe after World War I. But he was also a rigid ideologue who believed profoundly in the principle that the federal government should not provide direct relief to citizens. That it would damage American character and create dependency. That the economy would correct itself without government intervention. He had watched 25% unemployment develop on his watch and done relatively little. Now, with veterans camping in his front yard, he faced a political crisis. And he made the decision that would destroy his presidency. He called out the army, not to negotiate, not to facilitate a peaceful departure, to remove the veterans from federal property by force. The request went to Army Chief of Staff General Douglas MacArthur, who received it with something closer to enthusiasm than reluctance. MacArthur had convinced himself and convinced Hoover that the Bonus Army was not really a veterans movement. It was a communist conspiracy. A front operation designed to destabilize the government. He publicly declared that the Bonus March was animated by the essence of revolution. MacArthur was wrong. Every military intelligence report generated about the Bonus Army had concluded that it was exactly what it appeared to be, desperate veterans. But MacArthur believed what he wanted to believe. And on July 28, 1932, he made his preparations. At 4:45 in the afternoon of July 28, the troops assembled on the ellipse outside the White House. 200 mounted cavalry, sabers drawn. 5 WWI-era Renault tanks, 300 infantrymen with rifles, fixed bayonets, gas masks hanging ready at their hips. A machine gun crew set up an emplacement on the avenue. MacArthur was there in person. He had his dress uniform on, medals gleaming. His aide, Major Dwight D. Eisenhower, had begged him not to come. General, Eisenhower said, according to accounts from both men, this is not something for the Army Chief of Staff to be personally involved in. This will cause a political incident. MacArthur dismissed him. He wanted to see it himself. Eisenhower later said he was so uncomfortable with the entire situation that he refused to wear his uniform that day. He dressed in civilian clothes. He didn't want to be photographed in uniform at this event. Major George S. Patton commanded the 3rd Cavalry, the horses at the front of the column. At 4:45, Patton kicked his heels and the cavalry began to move. The veterans at first didn't understand what was happening. Some of them actually cheered. They thought it was a parade. The soldiers were in formation, moving down Pennsylvania Avenue. Some of the civilians lining the sidewalks applauded. Then Patton ordered the cavalry to charge. The horses thundered into the crowd. Veterans scattered, sabers came down, not cutting but driving people back with their flat sides and the sheer terror of mounted soldiers. The infantry came behind, bayonets leveled. Then the tear gas, not the relatively mild CS gas used in modern crowd control. Adamsite, an arsenical vomiting agent, a chemical weapon developed during World War I. The same kind of weapon these veterans had faced in the trenches, now being used against them on Pennsylvania Avenue. The canisters exploded. Clouds of choking, blinding, vomit-inducing gas poured through the avenue. Veterans who had survived German gas attacks in France choked and ran. Wives grabbed children. People scrambled for any exit. Within 2 hours, the Pennsylvania Avenue camps had been cleared. The veterans fled east across the Anacostia Bridge to Camp Marks on the Anacostia Flats. And here is where MacArthur did something that crossed a line that even Hoover had tried to draw. As MacArthur's forces reached the Anacostia Bridge, a message arrived from the White House. President Hoover had ordered the assault to stop at the river. The veterans in Camp Marks had not been the source of any disorder. They had wives and children with them. The camp was on separate ground. The order was explicit: do not cross the Anacostia. Major Eisenhower carried the message to MacArthur personally. MacArthur glanced at the paper in Eisenhower's hand and said, according to Eisenhower's own account, "I can't be bothered to read a letter during a military operation." He crossed the bridge anyway. His forces reached Camp Marks as evening fell. MacArthur gave the inhabitants 20 minutes to evacuate women and children. Then the tear gas went in. Then the soldiers with bayonets and torches. Systematically, methodically, they burned the camp, everything the veterans had, their tents, their lean-tos, the crude furniture they'd built from scavenged wood, their clothing, their papers. In many cases, their military discharge documents, the BEF news printing press, everything. The fires burned into the night, lighting up the Washington skyline with an orange glow that could be seen from the Capitol dome. Reporters who watched from across the river wrote that it looked like a city burning, which is exactly what it was, the day after. A man named Joe Angelo walked to Patton's quarters and asked to see the general. Joe Angelo had been Patton's orderly during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in September 1918. When Patton had been severely wounded and was lying in the open under fire, Joe Angelo had crawled to him, pulled him to cover, and saved his life. For this, Angelo had received the Distinguished Service Cross. He was one of the most decorated men in his unit. In 1932, Joe Angelo was homeless. He had walked from New Jersey to Washington to march with the Bonus Army. He had been gassed at Camp Marks the night before. He had lost everything he owned in the fire. He came to Patton to ask not for money, not for special treatment, but just to talk, to be acknowledged, to have Patton look him in the eye. Patton dismissed him without a word. He walked away. The New York Times ran the story the next morning under this headline: "A cavalry major evicts the veteran who saved his life in battle." That headline, that story. That is the Bonus Army in one sentence. The newspapers covered it. The newsreels covered it. Americans in movie theaters across the country watched footage of gas-masked soldiers driving veterans out of tent cities while the Capitol dome stood in the background. The reaction was not what Hoover had expected. He had thought clearing the veterans would look strong. It looked like exactly what it was. FDR, then governor of New York, running for president against Hoover, received a stack of newspapers the morning of July 29. He read them at his breakfast table in Albany. He turned to an aide and said, "According to accounts, this will elect me." He was right. Hoover lost the 1932 election in one of the biggest landslides in American presidential history. He won 6 states, FDR won 42. MacArthur somehow survived the incident politically. He blamed the whole thing on communist agitators, and the interpretation stuck, at least in military circles. He continued to rise. He became Supreme Commander in the Pacific in WWI. He commanded the liberation of the Philippines. He accepted Japan's surrender in 1945. His role in the Bonus Army became a footnote in his biography, a brief paragraph, a controversial moment early in his career. Eisenhower, in his memoirs, was more honest. He said he thought the whole thing was a mistake from start to finish, that he advised MacArthur against personal involvement. That it was one of the incidents in his career he was most uncomfortable looking back on. Patton said nothing. The story has a cruel addendum. After the Bonus Army was dispersed from Washington, many of the veterans had no place to go. FDR, despite his sympathy, wasn't going to immediately give them their bonus. He had his own economic concerns. What he did do was establish a program through the Civilian Conservation Corps that employed veterans in public works projects. A number of Bonus Army veterans took these assignments and were sent to build roads in the Florida Keys. September 2, 1935. A Category 5 hurricane, one of the most powerful storms ever to hit the United States, made landfall in the Florida Keys. The storm killed approximately 400 people. Many of them were Bonus Army veterans still living in temporary camps while working on the overseas highway. The government attempted to suppress news of the disaster. The relief train that was sent arrived too late. Hundreds of men who had survived the Western Front, who had survived the Great Depression, who had survived MacArthur's tear gas, died in a hurricane because the evacuation order came 4 hours too late. Ernest Hemingway was staying in Key West when the storm hit. He was one of the first people to reach the camps after the hurricane passed. He wrote about what he found, the bodies, the destruction, the clear evidence of governmental neglect, in an essay called "Who Murdered the Vets?" It was exactly as angry as the title suggests. The veterans did eventually get their bonus. In 1936, 4 years after the tanks drove them out of Washington, Congress voted to authorize immediate payment of the bonus certificates. FDR vetoed it. Congress overrode his veto. The veterans got their money. The full reckoning came later in 1944, while World War II was still raging. Congress passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, better known as the GI Bill. Education benefits, low-interest home loans, unemployment insurance, healthcare. Everything the Bonus Army had been asking for and more, formalized into law. The GI Bill was, in many ways, America's apology for the Bonus Army. An acknowledgement that when you send men to fight your wars, you owe them more than a certificate that matures in 20 years. You owe them a functioning life when they come home. It was one of the most successful pieces of legislation in American history. It created the American middle class of the 1950s. It funded the education of 8 million veterans. It enabled 12 million veterans to buy homes. The prosperity of post-war America was built substantially on the foundation of the GI Bill, but none of that undoes July 28, 1932. So why don't Americans know this story? Part of the answer is MacArthur. His reputation as a WWI hero was so enormous, so carefully cultivated, that the Bonus Army episode was simply absorbed into the mythology and minimized. A controversial early moment, not he attacked American veterans while disobeying a direct presidential order. Part of the answer is Hoover. History has not been kind to Hoover, but the specific horror of using the military against veterans has been subsumed into the general narrative of his failed Depression-era presidency. People know Hoover was bad, they don't necessarily know about July 28, 1932. Part of the answer is that the story is genuinely uncomfortable. It forces Americans to hold two things in their minds simultaneously: that their government can genuinely betray its own people, and that some of the most celebrated figures in American history did genuinely monstrous things. MacArthur, the hero of the Pacific, was also MacArthur who burned a veterans camp while ignoring a presidential order. Both are true. It's easier to only hold one. Here's what I want you to take from this. The men in Camp Marks had done everything right. They answered the call. They fought when their country asked them to fight. They came home and tried to rebuild their lives. When the economy collapsed and those lives fell apart, they did what Americans are supposed to do. They came to Washington and made their voices heard peacefully and organized. And their government sent tanks. Their government sent men in gas masks with arsenical vomiting agents. Their government sent a general who thought he was suppressing a communist revolution. Their government sent a cavalry officer who turned away the man who had saved his life. The signs they carried said, "We fought for you." The government's answer was fire. In 1944, when Congress passed the GI Bill and America made its implicit promise that this would never happen again, that veterans would come home to real support, real opportunity, real acknowledgement of their sacrifice, the ghost of the bonus army was in that room. The memory of Camp Marks burning was in that room. The image of Joe Angelo walking away from Patton's quarters was in that room. Sometimes the most important thing history can teach us is what happens when a country forgets its own people, when it treats sacrifice as an inconvenience and promises as optional. The bonus army didn't forget. They showed up, they organized, they demanded. And eventually, not in 1932, not for free, not without tanks and tear gas and fire, they got what they came for. Remember their names, remember their faces, remember what happened to them. Because the question their story asks, what does this country owe the people who fight for it, is one that every generation has to answer for itself.